Hi, this is Juan Pablo Pardo-Guerra. I'm an associate professor in sociology at UC San Diego and the author of Automating Finance. Today, I want to briefly talk about the experience of automation in the British financial system in order to tackle this question of why did stock markets automate? So the question of why stock markets automated is, of course, central and important given the fantastic transformations that we have seen in the financial system. 50 years ago, finance was a space created through personal interactions on physical trading floors such as this one. This is an image of the New York Stock Exchange trading floor from about 1965. And one of the features of this particular space is the density of bodies of human interactions as essential to performing, making finance possible. Today, of course, finance is nowhere near these physical spaces of face-to-face interaction. It is something that rather occurs in the servers of multiple companies scattered throughout the world as electronic signals through which investors communicate, exchange, and create the financial system through a cacophony of different types of interactions, of electronic, non-face-to-face interactions. This is a transformation that took place in less than 50 years. It is a momentous transformation for the financial system. And one of the things I tried to do is explore this as a case of slow institutional change. It is, of course, a very prominent transformation. In the past decade, we have seen increasing both popular and scholarly literature around the automation of financial markets as not only an interesting case study in how markets change, but as importantly as something that is essentially important for public policies, regulation, and so forth. Think, for example, of Michael Lewis's famous Flash Boys, which foregrounded moral concerns as something related to the emergence of this technological form, high-frequency trading, in finance in recent years. Exploring the automation of financial markets isn't just something about scholarly interests, it's about practical interventions that we can make in the financial system. And one of the questions that I think is prevalent and important and essential to tackle is this issue of why did stock markets automate? In order to explore things like this, in order to understand the emergence of entities and behaviors such as high frequency and algorithmic trading, we first need to understand what are the motives behind the automation of financial markets, and in particular stock markets, which are central institutions in this space. This is something that I do in my book from 2019, Automating Finance, Infrastructures, Engineers, and the Making of Electronic Markets, where I explore several cases and stories around the automation of financial markets. And I tackle this question centrally. I do so by exploring, for example, some traditional explanations, such as those offered by economics. Economics and the literature in financial innovation tends to treat the automation of stock exchanges and markets more generally as explainable in terms of costs. Stock exchanges automated, of course, because they made trading cheaper. This is, of course, something that is problematic, and we'll see how that is the case when we explore several examples from the British case. But in a sense, automation was not introduced initially as a cost-saving measure. It was the result of a buildup in the organization that allowed for these particular forms of automated electronic trading to emerge. Indeed, at the time that automation was first imagined, making things cheaper and reducing the cost of transactions was something that challenged the prominence of very important market actors, jobbers in the case of the UK system, or market makers more generally, who profited from the large spreads in the system. Making trading cheaper was something that actually affected many members of the system. Other explanations, of course, try to refer to political or ideological counts. One of the explanations we find in the literature is presenting the automation of financial markets as part and parcel of, for example, a neoliberal project. What this fails to recognize are the actual motives that are expressed by those who were in charge of automating financial markets. In interviews with them, and as I will show throughout this talk, political projects such as neoliberalism were nowhere to be found. The politics of automation was always organizational. It was small in a sense. It didn't necessarily refer to transforming the world around a distinct political project. It had to do with building units, building constituencies, building support within the organization. And this is what I explore in Automating Finance. Indeed, the approach of the book is understanding automation as really a gradual process of organizational change, where all these frictions, all these everyday controversies, all these small fights for power were ultimately essential and important in dictating the shape, form, and structure of automation in specific organizations. And I can do this, or the approach is based on this idea of recognizing infrastructures as these distributed, complex, taken for granted entities as the sites for automation. Automation wasn't something that happened when they introduced a single computer or a single device. It was something that occurred after the buildup of numerous types of entities that allowed for automation to happen, that changed the practices of the financial system, and that, in a sense, transformed the way people made markets on the floor and in their offices through technology. It's not, again, a punctual intervention. It was buildup, it was infrastructural, and it was slow. I do this in the book by looking at two cases. One is the automation of the London Stock Exchange in the 1970s and 80s. And the second is the creation of the national market system in the United States. For today's purposes, and in relation to the chapters that you are looking at, I will focus on the automation of the London Stock Exchange because it's particularly emblematic about these organizational processes of slow buildup and change. What I do to understand this process of automation, a process that went from having a heavily populated trading floor in the 1980s and 1960s to essentially seeing an entirely digital market in the 1990s, I do this, I explore this through three concepts. The concepts that I believe explain this transformation are those of capture, revelation, and conversion, which I'll introduce to you as I go through the story. These concepts really foreground this slow organizational change, this buildup of infrastructures, and how they related to both the market and the organization that contained all these trades, these traders, these brokers, et cetera, et cetera. And indeed, the first concept, that of capture, is all about this long process of organizational change whereby specific infrastructural workers, people affiliated and related to the creation of particular technical devices, encroach the organization and encroach the institution, changing slowly the way it thinks about itself and it thinks about its key operations, how they, by encroaching the organization, change, in a sense, its logics. And this encroachment is both organizational and infrastructural. So where does the story start? This is the trading floor of the London Stock Exchange in the late 1960s. As you can see, it is a densely human space. People are on the floor having conversations. Those conversations were part and parcel of the trading process. You can see some folks wearing top hats here and there. So just over here, there's a guy with a top hat. It was also a densely classed space. It was defined by the axis of class, like many elite institutions of the United Kingdom. The members on the floor were all people who had been inducted into the stock exchange. The trading floor was seen as this almost fraternal space where they would conduct their work. this was the key technology of the market. It was the very heart of the organization, not only in practical terms as the place where transactions occurred or took place, but also as the cultural core of the entire system. Of course, this very cultured, very sort of classed space, this very elite space was something that did not include technological innovations that would challenge the primacy of face-to-face trading. Indeed, they were sort of technophobes in the sense that, or the people who populated the stock exchange at the time, the members of the stock exchange, were sort of technophobes in the sense that they saw technology as a direct challenge to the primacy of this very space. And so how did this become an entirely electronic digital system? The story starts in the 1950s, when the stock exchange saw, after Second World War, increasing costs of settlement and clearing for the transactions that took place on the trading floor. This physical space where people would trade was incredibly expensive in terms of transaction costs for clearing and settlement, the matching of orders that took place on the floor and that had to be conferred and then executed at the end of the day. This execution, this clearing, was very costly and time-consuming. It required an army of clerks that essentially lived around the trading floor that would confirm every single trade that occurred in that space, and that required very specific skills and expertise in order to deal with, for example, errors and clerical mismatches and so forth. One of the issues with that is that these armies became, as volumes increased after Second World War, increasingly expensive. Maintaining this human-based form of settlement and clearing became a critical cost issue for the organization. The cost was settlement. It wasn't trading itself. It was all about clearing and settlement, the back office, a space that was seen as being lesser than the trading floor. And so what happened in the story was that the London Stock Exchange decided to rent or lease initially a very early generation of tabulators and subsequently computers to mechanize some of the work that was done in settlement, and doing so reduce the cost for the organization. It was really just a way of making membership cheaper rather than automating trading. The computers that were introduced did not touch the trading floor. They were always situated in the settlement department. They were as far as possible, both physically and organizationally, from the trading floor as the members could guarantee. Of course, the stock exchange soon realized that the maintenance of computers required having human appendices. Having computers within the organization required bringing in teams of experts, of technologists, of techies or market engineers that would keep these systems viable, operational, and working throughout the day. If they depended too much on the companies that they leased their computers from, they would face, in some occasions, sort of delays of a couple of days in their settlement schedule. This was something that was seen as expensive and risky. And so in the 1960s, the London Stock Exchange decided to internalize some of the maintenance of these computers by hiring technologists to keep these systems in order. Remember that this was a highly classed system. The techies that arrived at the exchange were not seen as being valuable members of the organization. One of them confided in an interview of being sort of a pleb within the system. Why? Because they were not part of the elite. They were techies coming from all these new polytechnics that were emerging in the United Kingdom, and they were not seen as having the same credentials, capacities, or rights as full members of the organizations. They were employees, and their job was to keep these systems working as much as possible. Thus, they were largely invisible. Indeed, they could not share the same restrooms as the members of the stock exchange. They were physically separated from the membership. They lived in the basements. They lived in the steam and computer rooms. And as such, they were largely unseen by the organization's membership and leadership. However, they were very bright and they saw the opportunity to use these fancy systems that the stock exchange had purchased to automate some very primitive functions in the trading process. One of those was price visualization and dissemination. So again, this was a physical trading floor. If you wanted to know the price of a share, you had to go to the trading floor and ask a jobber. There was no other way to know what the actual prices in the market were. Some firms got around this by installing these cameras in rooms, along with a whiteboard where one of their clerks would write down the numbers of, or the prices, the quotes for the most popular shares in the market. And that information, that data would be transmitted through coaxial cables to the offices of these member firms, whoever was paying for the service. This was a very ad hoc system. It didn't imply standardization of prices. It's something that only certain firms could afford and had access to. And it was terribly inefficient because it was just one channel of data communication traveling to the offices of member firms. What the techies decided to do is to use all the spare capacity in the computers that the stock exchange had purchased to automate this process. Again, it wasn't automating the trading floor, it was automating price visualization, something that was actually convenient for members of the organization. And so they did. In the late 1960s, they introduced the first price dissemination system in Europe, MPDS. MPDS was highly successful because it was built using technologies that provided great convenience for the members of the stock exchange. In particular, those TV sets in the image right above could be used not only to see prices and to keep track of where the market was, but also, importantly, to watch cricket when the market was subdued and was not too active. As such, these TV screens with a little bit of added logic and some standardization of the price collection system were incredibly successful for the organization and started populating member firms throughout the city and creating income and services for the stock exchange. This gave the techies in the stock exchange, these invisible folks who had been hired to keep the machines in the basement running, a little bit more power. It allowed them to expand slightly into other areas of the market. Indeed, by the early 1970s, techies had established a niche within the organization, the Directorate of Information Services and Settlement, that gave them some autonomy in the design of systems. And because they were becoming a source of revenue for the organization, people left them be. They didn't mind what they were doing as far as they didn't touch the trading floor. And they also did not interfere in the designs that they were proposing for the market. They were largely left to play with these fancy, expensive equipments as they saw fit. Of course, with time and as computing changed and as the affordances of devices that these techies were exposed to also changed, they started imagining different forms of intervening in the markets. By the late 1970s, for example, they were thinking about solutions for the marketplace that implied more real-time applications. So instead of having slower things, as in settlement, where processes generally tend to take between 24 and 48 hours, techies were thinking about using all these new systems for real-time applications, things that would allow, indeed, in the long run, automated trading. And they had grown tremendously from their small groups in the late 1950s and early 1960s. From a handful of techies by the late 1970s, stock exchange employees involved in tech development numbered around 500 and occupied about 8 buildings in the city of London. From the basement of the exchange, they had managed to indeed encroach the organization completely and importantly. In the early 1980s, the techies were given a unique opportunity to shape the future of the organization when the UK government forced the stock exchange to deregulate. One of the key changes in deregulation was the elimination of single capacity. Single capacity had been a form of trading, a division of labor in the marketplace that had existed for around 150 years at that time. What it meant was that brokers and market makers had to be different organizations and entities. A firm could not operate as both a broker and a market maker at the same time. Deregulation ended this and so transformed the structure of the market. The members of the stock exchange really had no clue of what the future would look like. And a lot of the work of designing the market for the sort of post-Big Bang period, as this transformation was called, was left in the hands of techies. Techies found this a tremendous opportunity because they could develop systems that ultimately transformed the logic of the floor. They could develop systems that allowed, for example, for trading to occur over the phone rather than face-to-face on the trading floor by visualizing prices in real time. This was indeed the case of one of their introductions, one of their innovations, the trigger screen. The trigger screen was prepared for Big Bang. This was in 1986, and it was meant to emulate the activity that was taking place in the market. This was the product of multiple conversations and skills and knowledge that the techies had assembled throughout their 20-something years at the London Stock Exchange, and that reflected their understanding of the market. The trigger screen is, until today, a very effective device for giving us a sense of where the market is. And it uses very simple visualizations through colors and flashes and changes to give us a sense of market movements. If something is red, it means that the price has gone down. If it's green, it means that the price is stable, and blue, it means that the price is going up. This was also associated to the introduction of indices like FTSE 100 and all those other sort of innovations that were also tied to the work of techies. But importantly, it was an opportunity to shape how the market consumed information and effectuated trades. It seemed to be something that was not necessarily relevant for the trading process itself. However, it was fundamentally important in shaping the future of the organization. Indeed, just after Big Bang, a couple of days or weeks after Big Bang, systems like the trigger screen had been so effective at sort of shaping practices within the organization, at mirroring what was happening on the trading floor, that the trading floor was largely abandoned. Despite millions of pounds of investments in the trading floor, by a month or a month after Big Bang, it was largely out of use. Indeed, what they had managed to do with all this slow layering of technologies, this slow encroaching of the organization, was to radically transform the logic of the stock exchange. They had managed to eliminate this central cultural piece, this central cultural meeting space, the trading floor, and substitute it with a panoply of technologies that were developed by their own teams. This is something that actually comes across the interview with one of the chief developers, Peter Bennett, who was responsible for most of the strategy of the stock exchange at the time. As he confided again in an interview, he said the whole driving force came from the IT people, but this became a problem because the IT people were effectively setting policy, and like it or not, around Big Bang time, it was working very well. It was a bull market. Everyone was onwards and upwards. The old member firms were cashing out. New member firms were coming in. Of course, in 1987, this ceased to be the case. When the financial crisis hit in 1987, when there was a global contraction of financial markets, the costs of operating these systems started to exceed the revenues that they generated. And by the early 1990s, the exchange decided to disband its technical teams and close all these sources of innovation and organizational change that they had had over time. And this leads us to a second concept, which is revelation. By revelation, I mean a series of discursive strategies that allow infrastructural workers to show the materials of the market, the underbelly of the market, in a way that creates a sense of security in the system. And this story of revelation really starts with this disbanding of the techie teams of the London Stock Exchange. In particular, Peter Bennett, the guy that I just talked about a couple of slides ago, decided to build his own stock exchange. This was something that was inspired in projects that the London Stock Exchange had had initially. Those projects involved building a sort of European-wide transaction tape for all of the exchanges in the continent. The project eventually did not happen, but it was seen as something that was desirable, profitable, and necessary for the system by technologists like Peter Bennett, who decided to go ahead and try to build it. For this, of course, they needed to have a stock exchange that would support them. And so they decided to create one, which was called TradePoint in the early 1990s. TradePoint was formed by 3 stock exchange refugees, Peter Bennett, Michael Wallerbridge, and Stephen Wilson. The 3 had worked at the London Stock Exchange developing systems. And TradePoint was built directly in opposition with everything that the London Stock Exchange represented. This is Michael Wallerbridge, in an interview talking about the logic of the exchange that they were creating. As he noted, TradePoint was consumer-led at the institutional level. Investors in this new exchange would have equal access to the price formation mechanism, which would then bring along competition, lower charges, be better for the pension funds, better for the savings. We even thought of calling it the People's Exchange, in the sense that it would be working very much at a neutral stance. This oppositional morality, or this oppositional logic of TradePoint, was also seen in where it was founded, where it existed. Rather than using the streets and buildings of the old city of London, where most financial institutions were still based, they decided to build TradePoint in Thames Wharf, a then up-and-coming artistic and creative area that signaled a different way of doing finance. This is very similar to the electronic communication networks that emerged in the United States in the 1990s, and which were directly oppositional in logics, in organization, and in operation to the established stock exchanges like the New York Stock Exchange. This oppositional logic was also something that we could see in how the founders of TradePoint represented themselves. This is in a photo from GQ from 1992 of some of the members of TradePoint. Peter Bennett is at the front of the photo. They're all dressed like Steve Jobs because, again, they didn't want to represent or to have an exchange that spoke to these elite traditions of finance in Britain, but wanted something that was new, unique, creative, et cetera, and that was represented by this allusion to Steve Jobs and all the new happening things in tech. And it was, of course, oppositional in terms of the very basic market construct that was behind the system. Unlike the London Stock Exchange, which still operated through calls that brokers would have to make to market makers in order to determine a price and then conduct a trade, it was a quote-driven system. What TradePoint offered was an order-driven system where a central limit order book would effectuate all the trades. The key innovation introduced by TradePoint to the United Kingdom was this emerging technology of the limit order book that would allow most of the activity to take place in electronic ways through essentially investors submitting their orders to an algorithm that would match these in some fashion according to a principle of price and time priority. Indeed, the problem with this was that it was a bit too revolutionary for the cultures of finance in Britain at the time. This is Michael Waller-Bridge with TradePoint. TradePoint essentially looks like a glorified Excel sheet. And this is something radically different from the images of the trading floor populated by individuals who were sort of encoding to some extent not only eliteness, but also the history of finance in Britain. Could a trading floor, something as complex as even a modern trading floor with banks of phones, screens, and so forth, be substituted by something as simple as this small computer, as something as apparently simple as a glorified Excel sheet? That was one of the questions and issues that TradePoint confronted. To solve this, they recurred to this act of revelation. And this is seen in a particular moment where they were trying to sell the system to potential investors. This is Michael Waller-Bridge, who was CEO of TradePoint at the time, recalling the strategy that they adopted in order to sell the system to potential users. As he noted, TradePoint used commercial computers, and I do remember investors saying, this must be a huge computer, absolutely vast to deal with an electronic market. But the actual computer was probably the size of a sofa. So I asked our operations manager to go and buy the biggest, fattest wire possible, like the ones in a James Bond film. And you have a room and it says computer room on it. And you put the computer in there and then you have this giant wire, this sort of pipe thing coming out of the room. Then you can say, the computers are in there. We don't like to disturb the computers. But that is the computer room. And investors would see this huge pipe going in, and it somehow gave a sense that there was power and depth to the whole operation. Indeed, these were not sort of naive investors. These were firms like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, et cetera, who were going into the offices of TradePoint to consider investing and participating in this new marketplace. But somehow, even despite the fact that they were well-informed and not naive, these performances allowed TradePoint to sell the system and to sell the power, depth, and importance of the system to all these potential investors. And they were indeed quite successful. TradePoint was initiated. It was successful for a few years after this. It was never truly a huge challenge to the London Stock Exchange in terms of market share, but it was a fundamental challenge to the London Stock Exchange in terms of the new forms of market making activity that could happen on its system. Indeed, the process that followed that transformed not only sort of finance in the world of TradePoint, but British finance more broadly, involved a conversion of a field into forms of market making that were more like the ones that the techies had been pushing for since the 1980s. Real-time, computer-based forms of market making that were based on their ideas of what the world should be like, and in particular on this construct, the limit order book. And the process of conversion was something that could be seen in how different actors across the system aligned to the affordances and the characteristics of the new systems introduced by TradePoint. For regulators in particular, the whole idea of having something like TradePoint and authorizing it through legislation and regulation was that it made competition possible. And they saw competition as a good thing. As one regulator sort of confided, they said that we wanted more competition in financial services, and thus they allowed TradePoint to happen and to challenge the monopoly that the London Stock Exchange held till then. There were also, of course, other actors from outside of the United Kingdom that were used to using these types of constructs, things like limit order books. And in particular, foreign global investment banks saw the mechanics and the operation of the LSE as being antiquated and asked for the market making system to be removed and replaced with limit order books, which is indeed another source of conversion for the British system. And then there was also, of course, an emerging series of actors, people that we would now identify with electronic or algorithmic trading, that were becoming represented in what TradePoint was offering. As Waller-Bridge recalled, some members of TradePoint were represented by boxes with flashing lights, and there was definitely some experimental algo trading going on. With these different constituencies enrolled and convinced about the feasibility of TradePoint, the London Stock Exchange really had very little space to maneuver. And by 1996, a few years after the introduction of TradePoint, they were forced to adopt an electronic system that was order-driven and used a limit order book at its core. Indeed, they unanimously and immediately recommended and adopted a system that challenged these traditions that had been in place for almost 200 years at the time, and that fundamentally transformed the way finance happened in the United Kingdom. It fundamentally automated the system into the future. So to this question of why did stock markets automate, what I do in the book is I give, of course, a nod to the work that was exercised by managers, traders, dealers, investors, regulators, et cetera, et cetera. They were necessary in order to adopt automated technologies. The electronic limit order book would never have been accepted or been successful without them complying, using it, adopting it in their practices. However, the electronic limit order book would not have happened, and this form of automation that we see today would never have occurred without this invisible work by engineers who were slowly transforming their organizational settings, changing the logics of finance, and sort of also modulating discussions about what is correct, legitimate, and moral in the market. And this small process of organizational change is extremely important if we are to understand how financial enterprises, organizations, and so forth actually adapt to their environments, change over time, and in doing so, transform the very fabric of the marketplace.